Welcome to Caledonia Sleeps, your peaceful escape into the heart of Scotland. The fire is burning low in the hearth tonight. Spring has arrived at last. You can feel it in the softness of the air, in the way the light lingers long past supper time. The gorse is flowering on the hillsides, and somewhere just beyond the window, a blackbird is singing the last of the evening down. But there are places in Scotland where spring does not soften things, where the cold never quite leaves the ground, where old stones hold old memories, and the dead lie closer to the surface than you might expect. Tonight, we are going to walk through some of Scotland's most ancient kirkyards, those churchyard burial grounds that have been receiving the dead for centuries upon centuries, layer upon layer, story upon story. We are going to stand among the headstones in the long spring gloaming and listen to what the stones remember. So let us begin. Pull the blanket a little closer. The blackbird has stopped singing. The light is fading now, and the spring dark is settling in, soft and quiet and full of patience. Let us go among the sleeping stones. St Andrews sits on the eastern coast of Fife, where the land meets the North Sea and the cold wind comes in off the water. On a spring evening, the light here turns the old sandstone amber, the gulls wheel above the harbour, and the whole place seems to exist in a slightly different time from the rest of Scotland. Older, more weighted, more aware of what lies beneath it. At the eastern end of the town, where the ground drops toward the sea, stand the ruins of what was once the largest cathedral in Scotland. Begun in 1158, consecrated by Robert the Bruce himself in 1318, it was the spiritual heart of Scotland for over 2 centuries, a golden shrine, a seat of archbishops, a destination for pilgrims crossing Europe. Then, in June 1559, a Protestant mob tore it apart in a matter of days. The altars smashed, the shrine destroyed, the building abandoned and stripped for stone by the townspeople who had once worshipped inside it. What remains is extraordinary in its bleakness. The great east gable standing open to the sky, the south nave wall running the length of the site, the slender finger of St Rule's Tower rising 33 metres above the ground, older than the cathedral itself, and spreading across the ground where the cloisters once stood, between the broken walls and the long spring grass, the kirkyard. The kirkyard is haunted, profoundly, insistently, and by multiple presences, but one haunting stands apart from all the others, and it is the one we have come here for. Walk along the precinct wall of the cathedral. The long, high boundary wall that encloses the entire cathedral grounds and runs for nearly a mile around the site, and you will notice the watchtowers set into it at intervals. They are 2 stories tall, most of them round, and the date from the medieval period when the precinct needed to be defended. Most of them are unremarkable, but there is one that is different from the rest. It is the only square one. You cannot miss it. It stands at the southeast corner of the precinct, looking out toward the sea, and something about it feels wrong, in a way that is difficult to articulate. Not dangerous exactly, more as though it is paying attention to you, in a way that the other towers are not. The locals call it the Haunted Tower. They have called it that for as long as anyone can remember. After the Reformation, when the cathedral was abandoned and the great religious community dissolved, the tower was used as a private mausoleum by a local family, most likely the Cleffanes, who had connections to the site. Many of the family died of the plague, and the tower was sealed up after the last burials were made, its contents forgotten, its door locked and left. The years passed. The cathedral fell to ruin around it. The town grew up and moved on, and the tower sat sealed and silent, looking out at the sea. Then, in 1868, stonemasons carrying out repair work on the precinct wall noticed something wrong with the tower, cracks in what appeared to be a sealed section. They investigated, and behind the stonework, they found a chamber that had been shut away for centuries. Inside the chamber were coffins, several of them, in varying states of preservation. The stonemasons, who had been expecting to find nothing more than old rubble, found themselves face to face with the dead of 300 years ago. One of the coffins had no lid. Inside it lay a woman. She was small and dark-haired, her features still discernible after all those centuries in the seal dark. She was dressed entirely in white, and on her hands, folded across her chest, she was wearing white leather gloves. She looked, by all accounts, as though she were simply sleeping. The stonemasons sealed the chamber again. The dead were left where they lay, and the tower was given its name. The White Lady had been reported in the grounds of St Andrews Cathedral for over 200 years. The sightings are remarkably consistent across witnesses who had no knowledge of each other, across generations, across the full span of recorded local history. She is always described the same way: small, slim, dark-haired, dressed entirely in white, wearing white gloves. She moves along the precinct wall, particularly between the castle and the haunted tower, with a fluid, gliding motion that does not quite look like walking. She is luminous. Several witnesses have described her as giving off her own light, visible even on the darkest nights. She has been seen by students from the university, by fishermen coming up from the harbour in the early morning, by elderly residents who have spent their whole lives in St Andrews and thought themselves immune to surprise. On one occasion, she passed directly through a locked iron gate in the precinct wall, in full view of a group of fishermen on their way back from the harbour. They were, by all accounts, considerably shaken. Those who have seen her describe a powerful sense of dread as she approaches, not malevolence exactly, but the feeling of being in the presence of something that belongs to a different order of existence, something that does not acknowledge the living as having any particular claim on its attention. There is a warning attached to the White Lady that has been passed down in St Andrews for generations. She is said to beckon to those she encounters, a slow, deliberate gesture, drawing the witness toward her, and those who approach, drawn despite themselves, may see her raise her veil. A student from the university in the early 1960s is said to have accepted that invitation. He was found the following morning, slumped against the precinct wall, insensible, repeating the same word over and over. He never fully recovered. The story has been told in St Andrews ever since. Whether or not that particular account is true, the consistency of the older sightings is striking. The paranormal researcher Jeff Holder, who wrote a dedicated study of the ghosts of St Andrews, documented multiple independent accounts spanning nearly 2 centuries, all describing the same figure in the same location. The White Lady of St Andrews is not a vague atmospheric impression. She is a specific, repeatedly witnessed presence that has been part of this town for longer than anyone living can remember. There are other presences in this graveyard. St Rule's Tower, the older church whose slender tower still stands at the heart of the cathedral grounds, is haunted by a monk. He is, if anything, a comforting presence. He has been encountered on the narrow spiral staircase inside the tower, where the lighting is poor and the steps are worn smooth by centuries of climbing feet. He appears beside those who are struggling with the stairs, offering a steady arm. His robes are dark, his manner is gentle. Visitors who have felt him pass have described the sensation of something brushing past them in the tight confines of the stairwell, without weight, without warmth, but unmistakably present. He is believed to be the prior Robert de Montrose, who was murdered in the cathedral in 1393 by a monk he had disciplined. The monk crept up behind him and threw him from the top of the tower. His ghost is said to reenact that fall on certain nights. Witnesses have reported seeing a figure tumbling from the parapet in the half-dark and then simply ceasing to exist before it reaches the ground. Stand in this kirkyard on a spring evening as the light goes down and the gulls come in from the sea and the broken walls, of the greatest cathedral Scotland ever built turns gold in the last of the sun. The grass between the graves is soft and green. The headstones lean at the angles of centuries. The haunted tower stands at the edge of your vision, square and still and watching. Somewhere inside it, behind the sealed stonework, the woman in white gloves lies as she has lain for 300 years, undisturbed, waiting. And in the kirkyard, as the spring dark settles in and the sea mist begins to drift in off the water, something moves along the precinct wall, luminous, purposeful, paying no attention to the living at all. Do not let her see you looking, and if she beckons, simply walk away. From Fife we travel west into Glasgow, and Glasgow is a different Scotland entirely from St Andrews. This is an industrial city, a city built on steel and shipbuilding and the labour of the working people. The streets are wide, the buildings are massive and dark with stone, and to the south of the river, in the area known as the Gorbals, there is a cemetery that the locals call, with complete unsentimental accuracy, the Gravy, the city of the dead. The southern necropolis sits on rising ground off Caledonia Road, a vast Victorian cemetery opened in 1840 that eventually received the bodies of more than 250,000 Glaswegians. It is a sprawling, atmospheric place, great stone monuments and elaborate Victorian tombs crowding up the hillside, iron railings marking family plots, stone angels standing in attitudes of grief that the decades of weather have made genuinely eerie. The grass grows long between the graves. Crows gather in the trees above. In spring there are wildflowers pushing up between the headstones, a kind of stubborn beauty that the city never quite manages to suppress. But the southern necropolis is not primarily known for its beauty. It is known for two things: the woman in white and the vampire. The woman in white has been reported by numerous visitors over the years, always in the early hours of the morning, when the cemetery is empty and the city sounds are muffled and the light is strange. She is described consistently, pale, luminous almost, drifting between the headstones with a motion that is not quite walking. She does not look at those who see her. She seems absorbed in something that the living cannot perceive, moving from grave to grave, pausing, moving on. Some say she hums softly, others say she stops and seems to point at certain graves, as though directing attention to the forgotten dead beneath. Nobody knows who she is. The southern necropolis received Glasgow's dead for over a century. The poor buried in mass graves with no markers, the middle classes in elaborate stone tombs, the Victorian merchant class in mausoleums that still stand. Any one of 250,000 people might have unfinished business here. The woman in white in this cemetery could be almost anyone. What is notable is that those who have seen her do not describe feeling afraid. What they describe, almost universally, is a profound and unexpected sadness. Not their own sadness, something that seems to come from outside them, passing through them like cold water, leaving them feeling both bereft and inexplicably moved, as though they have accidentally stumbled into the edge of a grief so large and so old that they can barely perceive its full extent. But the southern necropolis is haunted by older things than ghosts. There is a creature in the folklore of Glasgow's south side that predates the necropolis by decades. She is called Jenny with the iron teeth. Jenny with the iron teeth. She is a hag, a witch, a bogeyman by another name, and she has haunted the streets and green spaces of the Gorbals since at least the early 19th century. Jenny's habit, in the tales told to frighten children into good behaviour, was to creep up behind her victims in the dark, sink her metal jaw into them, and carry them off to eat. She was particularly associated with the southern necropolis because the southern necropolis was where the children of the Gorbals played. In the overcrowded tenements of that part of Glasgow, one of the most densely populated and impoverished urban areas in Britain, for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was almost no green space, no parks, no gardens. The cemetery on the hill was where children went to run and shout and tell each other stories in the long summer evenings. They grew up among the graves. They played hide and seek behind the Victorian monuments. They sat on the tomb walls and scared each other with stories about what might be lurking in the older, darker parts of the cemetery. And Jenny, with the iron teeth, was always there, just at the edge of the stories. The creature that came out when you stayed too long, that appeared in the darker corners, that had iron teeth and an appetite for children. On the evening of the 23rd of September, 1954, Police Constable Alex Deeprose was called to a disturbance at the southern necropolis. He arrived expecting vandals, not an unusual occurrence in the cemetery. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Hundreds of children were swarming across the graveyard. The youngest were barely old enough to toddle. The oldest were 14. They carried knives, sharpened sticks, homemade weapons. Some had brought their dogs. Many clutched crosses and crucifixes in their small hands, and they were hunting. The word had gone around the Gorbals schools that afternoon, spreading from playground to playground in the way that rumours do when they find exactly the right ear at exactly the right moment. A vampire had been seen in the southern necropolis, 7 feet tall, with red glowing eyes and teeth made of iron. It had killed 2 children from the area and eaten them. Something had to be done. The children of the Gorbals, who had spent their whole lives playing among these graves and telling each other stories about what lurked here, decided to do it themselves. The steelworks behind the cemetery were still running that evening, throwing up flames and belching smoke that rolled across the headstones in great sulphurous clouds. The flames lit the undersides of the clouds red. The gravestones leapt and flickered in the light. One boy who was there that night recalled it decades later. The red light made all the gravestones leap, he said. You could see figures walking about at the back, lined in red light. P.C. Deeprose tried to move the children on. They did not move. The hunt continued for hours. Shadows were seen between the monuments, whether shadows of children or something else. Nobody could be certain. Cries went up, shouts, the sound of hundreds of small feet running across old graves in the dark, dogs barking, the smoke rolling in from the steelworks, the red light flickering. The children only left when it began to rain. They came back the following night, and the night after that. Eventually interest began to wane, but by then the story had reached the national press, been debated in the House of Commons, and triggered a moral panic about the influence of American horror comics on British children. The Glasgow Vampire became briefly international news, and no 2 children who were there that night could quite agree on what they had seen. Nobody has ever established where the story began. No children had gone missing. There was no vampire. Of that, at least, everyone agreed. But the folklore researchers who have studied the incident point out that the creature the children described, 7 feet tall, with iron teeth, haunting a cemetery, eating children, matches Jenny with the iron teeth almost exactly. The old hag of the Gorbals, reinvented for 1954 in the language of American horror comics, given a new name and released into the cemetery where she had always lived. Something that old does not disappear just because the world changes around it. It simply finds new clothes. The southern necropolis is open during the day. People walk dogs there. Local historians run tours. The great Victorian monuments are gradually being restored. The wild flowers grow between the headstones in spring, and the crows sit in the trees, and the city hums and rumbles all around. But in the early hours, when the city goes quiet and the light is strange, the woman in white still drifts between the graves, and somewhere in the older, darker parts of the cemetery, where the trees grow thick and the monuments crowd together, and the paths become narrow and uncertain, the shadows move in ways that do not always quite correspond to what is casting them. Jenny with the iron teeth is still there. She is always there. She is waiting for someone to stay just a little too long. We will now leave the industrial city of Glasgow and travel east to Edinburgh. Edinburgh at dusk in spring is a city that exists in two registers at once. The surface Edinburgh is all warm pub windows and cobblestones gilded by the last of the light. The smell of hops and wood smoke drifting out from open doors. The distant sound of someone playing fiddle somewhere on the Royal Mile. It is a beautiful city at this hour, almost gentle. But walk down the Royal Mile far enough, past the tourist shops and the buskers and the knots of people heading to evening meals, and you will come to a quieter stretch where the road widens slightly and the buildings pull back. Here, on the left-hand side, as you descend toward the palace, you will find a low stone wall and a wrought iron gate, and beyond it, the sloping ground of Canongate Kirkyard. In spring, it is surprisingly lovely. Daffodils push up from the grass between the headstones. The cherry trees along the boundary wall are in blossom. Pale pink petals drifting across the graves whenever the breeze catches them. You might almost miss how old it is, how many dead it holds, how much has happened here. Canongate Kirkyard was established in 1688 when the Canongate Kirk was built for the people of the borough of Canongate, the old separate town that once sat just outside Edinburgh's walls. For over 300 years, the residents of this part of the city have been laid to rest in this ground. Soldiers and poets, philosophers and merchants, a murdered courtier. And tucked quietly into one corner, the man whose gravestone accidentally gave Charles Dickens one of the most enduring characters in English literature. We will get to all of them, but first, let us stand here a moment in the softening light and feel the weight of what this place holds. The kirkyard slopes gently uphill from the gate, and from the higher ground you can see the palace of Holyrood House at the bottom of the Royal Mile. Its towers pale against the spring sky. Arthur's Seat rises behind it, the ancient volcano that watches over the city with prehistoric patience. The first story I want to tell you concerns a man named David Rizzio. Rizzio was an Italian musician who had come to the court of Mary Queen of Scots in the 1560s, working first as a singer and then rising to become the Queen's private secretary and closest confidant. He was charming, cultured, and very close to Mary, perhaps too close by the standards of the men who surrounded her. Her husband, Lord Darnley, was jealous. The Protestant lords of Scotland distrusted him, and so, in the way that things happened in the 16th century in Scotland, a group of armed noblemen decided to solve the problem permanently. The evening of the 9th of March, 1566, found Mary in her private apartments at Holyrood House, just down the hill from where we are standing now. She was 6 months pregnant. She was at supper with a small group of companions, Rizzio among them, when the door opened and the conspirators entered. Lord Darnley was with them. Rizzio saw what was coming. He grabbed at Mary's skirts, begging for mercy in Italian, in English, in whatever language he could find. Her attendants were pulled aside. Rizzio was dragged from the room. He was stabbed 56 times. The blows came from multiple hands and multiple weapons in a corridor just outside the Queen's chambers. It was not quick. It was not clean. It was a political execution dressed up as a crime of passion, and even in a century not short of spectacular violence, it shocked those who witnessed it. Tradition says that his body was eventually brought to this kirkyard. A small bronze plaque on the east wall of the church, above a worn 17th century gravestone, reads simply, "Tradition says that this is the grave of David Riccio, 1533 to 1566, transported from Holyrood." That word, tradition, is doing a great deal of work. Historians have long doubted that a Catholic Italian courtier would have been reinterred in a Protestant kirkyard over a century after his death. The most likely truth is that he lies in Holyrood Abbey, in an unmarked spot that nobody has been able to identify with certainty. And so Rizzio exists here in a state of uncertainty, possibly present, possibly not. His grave marker, a tradition rather than a fact, a story the city tells because it needs somewhere to put such a violent death, such a restless soul. Some who walk this kirkyard at dusk say they feel something near the plaque, a coldness that has nothing to do with the air temperature, a sense of being watched from no particular direction. One or two have reported hearing, very faintly, something like music, a melody they cannot quite place, gone the moment they try to focus on it. An Italian melody, some say, drifting up from somewhere beneath the ground. Whether the ghost of David Rizzio truly walks here, no one can say with certainty, but the restlessness feels real enough, and in a city as layered as Edinburgh, perhaps it does not matter precisely where the body lies. The story is here, and the story is what haunts. Not every ghost in Canongate arrived by violence. Some came by accident, by misreading, by a single wrong syllable on a worn old stone. In 1841, Charles Dickens visited Edinburgh. He was 30 years old, already famous, at the height of his powers. He walked along the Royal Mile one afternoon, and turned into Canongate Kirkyard, as visitors have done for centuries. He was wandering among the headstones when he came across a grave that stopped him in his tracks. The stone read, as he understood it, Ebenezer Scroggie, mean man. Dickens was appalled. To have that as your epitaph, to be remembered for eternity as a mean man, seemed to him the most terrible of fates. He was so troubled by it that he could not stop thinking about it as he walked away. What kind of life ended in such a verdict? What kind of shrivelled, cold, loveless soul could earn that name? The character he eventually wrote, the miser redeemed by 3 ghostly visitors on a cold winter's night, became one of the most beloved figures in English literature. Ebenezer Scrooge, born of a misreading in an Edinburgh kirkyard on an ordinary spring afternoon. Because Dickens had misread the stone entirely, it did not say mean man. Ebenezer Scroggie, the real man, buried here in Canongate, was a corn merchant. His epitaph read, Mealman. Scroggie was, by all accounts, a cheerful and generous soul who once gate-crashed a General Assembly of the Church of Scotland and was reprimanded for pinching the bottom of a countess. Scroggie's grave marker was lost in construction work in 1932. There is no stone to visit now, but the story remains. A man's epitaph misread, a phantom of meanness conjured from a single wrong syllable, and from that phantom, one of literature's most famous ghosts, 3 Christmas spirits shimmering into existence because of a mistake made among these headstones on an ordinary Edinburgh afternoon. The third and final story in this kirkyard is a quieter one, not a haunting in the traditional sense, no cold air, no flickering candle, no figure at the end of a corridor, just a grave and a debt that took 50 years to repay. You may have come across Robert Burns in our previous episodes, or perhaps you know him already, as most people do. But there was a poet who came before Burns, who shaped him, who showed him what Scottish poetry could be. His name was Robert Fergusson, and he is buried here in Canongate Kirkyard, not 20 yards from where we are standing. Fergusson died in 1774. He was 24 years old. He had been one of the most gifted voices Scotland had produced, sharp, funny, tender, full of life. He died in the Edinburgh Public Asylum, Darien House, a place of genuine horror by any standard, after a fall down a staircase left him mentally altered. He was penniless. He was buried in an unmarked grave. No stone, no inscription, nothing to say a poet lay here. 13 years later, Robert Burns came to Edinburgh. He visited Canongate Kirkyard and found Fergusson's grave, unmarked, forgotten, The ground where one of Scotland's greatest poetic voices lay completely indistinguishable from the earth around it. Burns was so disturbed by this that he applied to the Kirk Session for permission to erect a headstone at his own expense. They granted it. Burns paid for the stone himself. But Burns died in 1796 before he could oversee the inscription. The stone wasn't actually erected until 1828, 32 years after Burns died, 54 years after Ferguson. It was finally raised in fulfilment of a dead man's wish to mark the grave of another dead man. The stone is still there. You can stand beside it. It reads, "Here lies Robert Ferguson, poet, born September the 5th, 1751, died October the 16th, 1774, and beneath that, Burns' own words, the words he chose before he died. No sculptured marble here, nor pompous lay, no storied urn, nor animated bust. This simple stone directs pale Scotia's way to pour her sorrows o'er her poet's dust." People who linger near this grave on quiet evenings report something difficult to name. Not a presence exactly, more a quality of the air, a particular stillness, a sense of something unfinished that has been finally, very gently laid to rest. Some visitors describe feeling an unexpected creative urge near the grave, a sudden desire to write something down, to put something into words before the feeling passes. Whether that is Ferguson's influence or simply the power of the story, nobody can say. What is certain is this: two of Scotland's greatest poets are bound together here, across death, across decades, across the silence that falls when genius is extinguished too early. One remembered the other when the city forgot, and the stone that finally marks the grave was paid for by a man who would not live to see it placed. Stand here as the last light goes. Watch the blossom drift across the graves. Feel the temperature drop, as it does in all old kirkyards at the end of a spring day, the cold exhaling up from the earth as though the ground itself is breathing. You are standing on centuries, on a murdered man whose grave may or may not be here, on a corn merchant who became a miser, who became a parable of redemption, on a young poet who burned brightly for 24 years and then lay forgotten in the dark until a friend who had never met him came and refused to let him stay forgotten. Canongate remembers all of them. It does not forget. We have walked a long way tonight. We have stood in the ancient kirkyard of St Andrews, where the ruins of Scotland's greatest cathedral reach up into the spring sky, and a woman in white moves through the darkness with her own cold light, and a sealed tower holds its secret, and the dead of 1,000 years lie close beneath the grass. We have stood in the smoke and the red light of Glasgow's southern necropolis, where a woman in white drifts between the headstones, and the shadows do not always quite behave. And something very old and very hungry has been waiting in the darker corners since long before the cemetery existed. And finally, we have stood among the cherry blossom of Canongate in Edinburgh, with its murdered courtier, whose grave may or may not be here, its corn merchant who became Scrooge, and its young poet who lay forgotten in the ground. 3 kirkyards, 3 completely different kinds of haunting. Canongate is haunted by stories, by the violence that generates legend, by the misreadings that create new ghosts from old facts, and by the particular sorrow of talent extinguished too early, and the love that outlasts death. St Andrews is haunted by something more ancient and more inexplicable. The White Lady has no name, no verified identity, no story that fully accounts for her. She simply walks. She has walked for 200 years that we know of, and perhaps far longer. The haunted tower holds its dead and gives nothing away. Whatever she is, she belongs to this place in a way that feels older than the cathedral, older than the town, older perhaps than the Christian settlement on this headland, as old as the wind of the sea and the bones in the dark ground. And Glasgow is haunted by something older than any individual story, by the accumulated fear and imagination of a community that lived among its dead, that played in the cemetery as children because there was nowhere else to play, that turned its oldest nightmares into new shapes when the world changed around them. The Gorbals Vampire is a ghost story that tells the truth about poverty and powerlessness and the way that communities generate the creatures they need, not because the creatures are real, but because the fear that creates them is very real indeed. Scotland keeps its dead close. The kirkyard at the heart of the village, the grave above the bay, the cemetery on the hill that the children used as a playground. There is something in this habit of proximity that we have largely abandoned in the modern world, and something that, perhaps, we are the poorer for abandoning, because when you stand close enough to the dead, you begin to understand things about the living, about what endures, about what a community decides to keep telling itself and why, about which names, Rizzio, Ferguson, the White Lady of St Andrews, Jenny with the iron teeth, persists across centuries, and what that persistence means. The fire has burned down while we were away. The embers are red and very quiet. Outside, the spring night is soft and dark, and the last of the blossom is on the air. And somewhere not far from here, a kirkyard is breathing in the dark, its stones still holding a little warmth from the day's sun. The long grass moving gently over the sleeping dead. They are not frightening, not really. They are simply very patient. They have been waiting a long time for someone to come and listen. Sleep well tonight. Sleep deep and easy, wrapped in the knowledge that the world is old and full of stories, and that those who came before us are closer than we think, not as a threat, but as a weight of memory that holds us up, that keeps us anchored to something larger and older than ourselves. The old stones will stand and watch. They always have. They always will. And if these stories have stayed with you tonight, if the kirkyards of Scotland have found a place somewhere quiet in your thoughts, please do consider sharing Caledonia Sleeps with someone who might enjoy a little old, strange, very Scottish company in the dark. Like, subscribe, and walk with us again soon. Good night from the fireside. Good night from Scotland. Good night.